Hi, everybody. Steve Wilder back with you. Another one of our safety and security podcasts. And again, just like I've been with so many of the other ones, I'm super excited to have a dear friend and a close colleague joining us today. Stan Szpytek is the president of Fire and Life Safety in Mesa, Arizona. And Stan and I go back now probably 10 or 12 years. Very common backgrounds in the fire service. I'll let Stan talk about that, and we've worked together all over the nation. And I think we probably could introduce each other's bios without even having to look at them because we've heard them from each other so long. But Stan is just an incredible human being, just a dear friend, a colleague, somewhat of a mentor to me a year in the earlier years. And just the kind of guy I just enjoy spending time with and hanging out with and talking with. Stan, it's good to have you with us, buddy. Welcome aboard.
Steve, I think you're a little bit suspended in time. We're getting close to having this relationship for almost 20 years now.
20 years. Wow. That means I'm 12 to 15 years. You're 20 years. You're getting older. I'm not. Let's leave it at that. How's that?
Sounds good.
Hey, Stan, before we get started, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about your background, talk a little bit about Fire and Life Safety Inc.
Steve, like you, I was able to fulfill a dream at a pretty early age. We talk about people that influence us in our lives. For some people, it's celebrities or sports figures. For you and me, it was the firefighters that we saw in our communities. I remember being a little kid and being influenced probably in kindergarten or first grade when those firefighters came to my school during fire prevention week and hoisted me on top of the side of the rig and put that scary air mask up to my face. And I just remember um, my perspective was, I want to be one of them. And it was a dream that was succeeded at an early age. Like I said, the community that I lived in, the southwest suburbs of the Chicago area, Palos Park, had a paid on call fire department. They had a cadet program. At 15 and a half years old, I was knocking on the door. Certainly had some friends in high school who were involved with the cadet program, and their dads were on the fire department. And it was just a wonderful start to a journey that proceeded up to present day, where I was able to, at first, volunteer to be a firefighter in the community. I was lucky enough to be one of the community's first 6 full-time firefighter paramedics that were hired back in 1983. And kind of like in a blink of an eye, some of us can relate to that. 20 years kind of came and went as a full-time career. I was lucky enough to ascend through the ranks, wear a lot of hats on the department, retired as deputy fire chief and fire marshal. What was great about my position, I got to be in charge I got to be involved with operations. I got to be a first responder. I got to work shifts at the fire station, but I was also the community's code enforcement officer and public education officer and arson investigator and person that dealt with things like emergency management. Like most firefighters, we do something on the side. Many of us work in the trades. We do something in a similar profession, moonlight at other fire departments. I did all those things, but I also got this entrepreneurial urge to get into consulting. It was born kind of out of necessity. It was an administrator from an assisted living community that contacted me after she left the community where I was working as a healthcare professional. And she said, "Hey, all that stuff you did at our nursing home, where you'd come out and train the staff on how to race and how to pass, how to evacuate the building. You helped us prepare for that disaster that kind of never came. Remember Y2K, Steve? We probably got a lot of inquiries about what was going to happen when the computers crash and the clocks stop. But I had this entrepreneurial light bulb go off in my head. Everything that I was doing in my community to promote fire safety and emergency preparedness, I found a need by people out there, particularly at first in the healthcare sector, to to provide the same types of service, kind of in a in a private way. So I started to, I put together a business plan. I came up with a business. And the next thing I know, I'm working with assisted living communities, healthcare providers, community colleges, assembly occupancies in the Chicago area. And I just started promoting fire, life safety, and emergency preparedness. The original name of the company was Fire and Life Safety Strategies, and I changed it through the years, and it's now FLS, or Fire and Life Safety Inc.
And I remember, and I've heard this story told many times, on a national level, people just refer to you as Fireman Stan. Where,
Almost. They call me Stan the Fireman.
Stan the Fireman. There you go. Where did that start?
Well,
Tell
it
our listeners that story, because it cracks me up every time you tell me.
yeah, well, it was the first healthcare client that I went to outside of an assisted living facility. It was a skilled nursing facility uh, outside of my jurisdiction, right across the border, a place called Holy Family Villa. It was formerly in unincorporated Cook County, now in Palos Park. And I remember when I got my first version of my business cards printed up, I handed it to the administrator there, Bobby Magurani, who became not only a mentor, but a dear friend and someone that really launched my career. But she looked at me and she looked at my business card and she saw all the consonants in in my last name, and she said, "Yeah, I'll never be able to say that." She threw it at me and she says, "You know what? I'm just going to call you Stan the Fireman." And at first, it felt a little corny, but you know what? It wasn't too derogatory. And people remember me by it because they can't say Szpytek. Now, Steve, it's been almost 20 years. You're getting close. The Spittek isn't quite there. It's Spittek. I tell people just to spit it out, or if you feel comfortable enough, just call me Stan the Fireman.
I call you a lot of things, so I'm going to stick with that. Stan, we're talking today. The feature point on this podcast is a team approach to emergency preparedness. And as much as you and I joke, I absolutely respect you as probably the creme de la creme of emergency preparedness when I work with you. It's a topic I've learned so much from you over the years about. You're nationally recognized for your emergency preparedness programs, for developing plans, for continuity, for COOP, everything else. Let's talk a little bit about emergency preparedness. Where does it start? I mean, I'm the ABC company, whether I'm in healthcare, manufacturing, retailing, government, whatever. And I realized that I really don't have a good emergency preparedness plan. If the doomsday clock is coming close and I need to be prepared, how do I start?
Well, I think you and I have had the same experience working with so many different industries, maybe primarily healthcare and education. In your case, healthcare and senior living for me. But one of the things that we identified when we really started to dig our heels into preparedness years ago was that most occupancies, whether it's a healthcare facility, a school, a university, a business, um, their emergency preparedness perspective always seemed to be very geocentric. And what I mean by that was that if you were in the Midwest, like you and I were originally based before I moved to Sunny Mesa, Arizona, when I retired from the fire department, um, in the Midwest, our plans seem to be so focused on the weather, severe weather,
Correct.
tornado. If we're working down in Florida or a coastal region, well, it's all about tropical depression and hurricane. If we're in the Bay Area, it's all about seismic activity. Um, we realized that facilities had a very narrow focus on the threats and perils that could potentially impact their facilities. So, the first thing that you need to do when you're stepping off on that path to preparedness is knowing what you don't know. You've got to identify all the threats, all the perils, all the man made hazards, all of the mechanical failures, all of the acts of terror and violence, all of the naturally occurring events. You need to do what we call a hazard vulnerability assessment. Uh, in the healthcare sector that I primarily work in, there are several tools that are out there, basically spreadsheets that will help you scale the probability of occurrence, what your levels of preparedness are, both internally and externally, and what resources do you have from the community. Are you in a rural area that's got a volunteer fire department that's got maybe a variable response at different types of day? Are you in an area where you've got a paid force where the response usually is much quicker? But it goes beyond that, Steve. We also have to look at what's in the building that can cause some type of an emergency or disaster, but also what is proximal to the facility or the building or operation. Are you near a dam? Are you downstream from a dam that could break, like many of my clients' facilities were a few years ago in Northern California? Are you in the urban wildland interface where a wildfire 25 miles away at first glance might not have any impact on your operations, but when the wind shifts, all of a sudden you're downwind from a potential disaster? Are you near manufacturing, mining, any kind of peril in the community? So, hazard vulnerability assessment, identifying the threats, the perils, the circumstances that can impact your operation, puts you on a path to preparedness that will help you develop plans, policies, and contingencies, as well as protocols to deal with every type of conceivable emergency.
You mentioned in that explanation, which I do appreciate. I wish I could explain it as eloquently as you do. You mentioned though the concept of an all hazards approach. Can you kind of expound on that a couple minutes, Stan? I'm not sure all of our listeners would understand what you mean by that.
Well, I can give a great example, and I think you will agree, because if I started out at 15 and a half, Steve, when did you start in the fire service? I think you had a couple of years earlier than me that your community's cadet program let you be a cadet at what age?
12. My first the spark was lit when I was 6 years old, and my dad and I was in my dad's pickup truck with him, and we happened to be going by the local volunteer fire station, and the garage doors were open. And I asked him if we could stop and I could see the fire trucks. And he lifted me up on the back of one, stood me on the back step back in the old tailboard days. And the fever bit me then. So when I was 12, when I was 12 o'clock, when I was 12 years old and was able to join the cadet program, that's when I first got involved with it.
Yeah, and I think you'll remember in those days, and I think our commonality is it was at least the 70s. We both got in the fire service in the 70s. My specific year was 1977. But being a firefighter was all about putting the wet stuff on the red stuff, right? We responded to structure fires, field fires, vehicle fires. The fire service, started to evolve right about the time you and I got into the fire service, because then the next thing, firefighters became medical technicians, EMTs, and paramedics. And then all of a sudden, the scope expanded into other areas of specialty like hazardous materials, technical rescue. Think about our firefighters in our community today as I make this example. They are first responders to everything, including weapons of mass destruction, as we saw on that fateful day in 2001. So, our firefighters, our community's first responders, really need to have an approach to manage emergencies in an all hazards kind of way. How do they do that? Well, even a community like my community or your community conducts a hazard vulnerability assessment. They identify all the things that can happen. So that's step one in an all hazards approach, knowing what threats and perils are going to be out there. And then step two is having a way to manage any type of emergency, no matter if it goes sideways, if it goes upside down. I think of some of the terrible incidents that you responded to, that I responded to, that it seemingly at face value, maybe it came in as an automatic fire alarm, but when you got on the scene, it was anything but a routine call. Yeah, I think about one of the incidents that one of my clients' facilities had in Southern California, a tragic incident. I know you're familiar with it. Any firefighter in this country probably knows it, but it came in as a activated fire alarm at a senior housing, affordable housing property. On the way to the call, police got on the scene before the fire department got there and confirmed an active fire. And when firefighters got on the scene to do their job, put out the fire, as they made the charge up the stairs, they were met by an elderly resident with a gun who started to shoot at them, unfortunately killing the captain that was leading the charge. So what came in as a routine alarm turned into an active fire, turned into an active shooter situation. How does the person in charge manage that type of chaos? Well, as you and I know, Steve, we've got a process called the incident command system. Whether it's the fire department, whether it's the hospital that we work with, the nursing home, the retail operation, the manufacturing or distribution plant, some type of system of command and control is the second step in the emergency management all hazards process. You need to know what you're going up against. Then you need to have a way to manage the emergency, no matter which way it evolves or sidesteps, so that you can have what we call an all hazards approach.
Interesting. I like that. And I do remember that incident that you referenced. And I remember the shock and dismay we all felt with that one, because that's just not things that were back then anyway, that we were used to hearing about or that we ever believed could happen. If the fire service guys, they were always the good guys in the white hats. And people always embraced us, and we certainly know that's not true. But no, you totally, I think you're right on spot there, Stan, when you use that example with an all hazards approach. We talk about command and control, and you talk about incident command. Now, certainly, in the hospitals, we've got HICS, Hospital Incident Command Systems. We see it used in hospitals all over, and for the most part, they use it fairly well. A lot of hospitals aren't using the forms and stuff like that, but they're using the structure, the command and control structure. Long-term care facilities seem to be a little bit slower catching on, at least in the Midwest and in the eastern part of the nation. You more in the west and southwest part of the nation, maybe you seeing it a little differently, but it doesn't seem like the nursing home incident command system or the assisted living incident command systems, like those are catching on as quickly as we might have thought they would or want they would. Is command and control, first of all, if you want to talk about what we mean when we talk about command and control, it'd be great, but is command and control something that we're still wrestling conceptually to get it into the healthcare industry?
Yeah, it's still a challenge, and I think there's some reasons for those challenges, and it equates to the practicality and the focus of our training efforts. Um, you and I both have traveled the country, worked with many state healthcare associations. Again, primarily, I work with the long-term care industry. You work with hospitals and a bunch of other healthcare sectors. Um, and think about this, Steve. Who's typically in our sessions? We've got the administrators, maybe some regional um, support people. We've got maybe the maintenance directors or people from the facilities management staff. We've got people usually that are on that level of operations that is more supervisory and managerial. Now, here's one of the things that has really changed the focus of um, training that we're doing with many of my clients today. It's possible that the administrator will be at the facility when the emergency occurs, but as most of us know, probably not likely. Uh, it's also possible that maybe the facilities director or the director of nursing or a manager will be at a facility when the disaster or emergency occurs. But again, that's a variable. Who is always going to be at the facility when it comes to being in a position to managing the emergency? It is the frontline staff. So I think one of the opportunities for improvement that we're recognizing is that we've got to expand the educational process of teaching people how to be an incident commander by focusing on the front line, because That is the standard. That is the one variable that is never going to deviate. There's always going to be frontline staff within a facility, whether, again, if it's a manufacturing operation, a healthcare operation, an educational operation. Frontline staff, the people that are the boots on the ground, are going to always be there. And we've got to teach them that concept of command and control. And really, what it boils down to is that someone needs to be in charge. Because as you and I know, coming from the disciplined fire service and the way it's evolved, especially during our careers and beyond our careers in the fire service, we live and literally die by the incident command system. If something goes wrong, more times than not, whether it's NIOSH, a state regulatory agency, some type of investigative unit, when we do the postmortem on the incident, if something has gone wrong and a person has been injured or killed, we usually find more times than not there was a lack of command and control that was either uh, not in place at that particular incident or wasn't implemented to its full capabilities. Someone has to be in charge. That person is known as the incident commander. Doesn't matter if it's in your hospital or my assisted living facility clients, the person in charge is the IC, the incident commander. And then the incident command system is a simple management model. It's not rocket science. Anybody with a high school diploma, a college degree, any kind of certifications in business would basically say, wait a second, incident command is kind of like management 101. And what we say is it's kind of like management 101. Incident command is management by objectives. That IC, that person in charge, has to take on the responsibility of assessing the situation and coming up with the objectives of the incident to get it to a satisfactory outcome. Are we going to evacuate? Are we going to shelter in place? When we talk about objectives, we're typically talking about words or phrases that identify the priority or the goal that we're trying to accomplish. After we identify our objectives, we come up with an operational period. How long is it going to take to satisfy the objectives that have been identified? And once those two factors are determined, then the incident commander is going to delegate the responsibilities to see through those objectives to someone specifically so that the operation can move forward. That was incident command, Steve, in about 2 minutes. How did I do?
You did awesome, brother. And you made me, I had a couple flashbacks there. I can remember in my previous life, in the fire service when I was teaching at the State Fire Academy at University of Illinois, and I used to help out with teaching some of the command and general staff classes. One of the things I used to always tell them, and I tell my whether it's hospital or long-term care clients now when we're talking about command and control, one of the things I always tell them is if you're not there, you're not the boss. I don't care what your title is. You're home at midnight and the phone rings and they're telling you this is what's going down. Until you are there and you understand what they're dealing with and what they've done up to that point, you're not the boss. And that's a hard concept for some folks in leadership roles to understand, that your title doesn't immediately make you an incident commander, that the incident commander starts out with the person who's on the scene when the first call for help goes out or the first sign of a problem is identified. That's when your incident commander steps up and assumes position. And then later, when the folks from Mahogany Row and the C-suite start showing up, then you can have an orderly transfer of command. But if you're not there, you're not the boss. You agree?
100%. I listened to a pretty um, overt example of that. It was unfortunately very infamous mass casualty incident. The units on the scene took command and control of the situation. One of the battalion chiefs from the fire department, who was first on the scene, took command of the incident. And as the incident escalated and they started to get an idea of the seriousness of this, of course, those fire chiefs who were at home in bed had to be called out. And I remember hearing a radio transmission where I think it was second in command on the fire department was responding to the incident, and over the radio, he said that he was going to take charge. He was going to be in command. And there was a reply from the battalion chief, who was the identified incident commander, and said, Chief, I'm going to remain incident commander until you get on the scene and I can give you a face to face briefing of the situation. And dispatch, be advised that I will continue to be the incident commander. Now, it was a rebuff right on the air, but it really illustrated that just by virtue of your title or your position within an organization, until you're on the scene, until you've got a full understanding of what's going on, you're not in charge until that transition or transfer of command has occurred.
And that same concept applies in the private sector. And that's what, I try, and I'm sure you do too, the message I try to get across. I want to kind of shift gears here for a couple minutes, Stan. Doing an active shooter training program a week or two ago. Had a woman come up to me at the break and she said, "This is so awesome. We're getting ready to do an active shooter exercise at our office." And this was a non-healthcare person.
Mhm.
And I started asking her a little bit of, challenging her a little bit about how they had prepped to do the exercise and everything. And they really hadn't done anything. They're just going to do a full scale exercise. They had the local police helping them out. EMS, fire was all agreeing to participate, which is great. But I was trying to find the words to tactfully tell her, you're not ready to do a full scale exercise because you don't even know what your plan's going to do yet.
Mhm.
Respecting your expertise in training and drills and exercises and things along those lines. How do you approach those? How do you prep your clients to do an exercise to test, whether it's an active shooter plan, a fire plan, a weather emergency, utility failure, whatever the scenario might be?
Well, a successful drill doesn't happen by accident. I mean, it takes planning, resources, expertise, and particularly, my skin was crawling a little bit when you talked about a full scale active shooter exercise. I'm aware of some long term care facilities that are about to do a full scale exercise. And I'm not insinuating that there is a lack of planning, but the topic of an active shooter, along with the concept of people that may play the role of an armed intruder or assailant, take on the role of an active shooter. You and I both know this, Steve. There is a ton of preparedness that needs to go into a delicate exercise like that, because in my experience, no matter how much planning, promotion, communication we push out to all stakeholders or even people in close proximity to the exercise, there is going to be someone that's going to mistake it as a real world incident. I remember you and I had an experience like that at a hotel in Phoenix where we were doing some practical evolutions with the attendees. One of them involved a scenario where you yell, police, police, or shooter, shooter. And we got the attention of the people in the lobby, and there was some nervous looks our way. Do you remember that?
I remember that well, and I think you and I both learned an important lesson that day.
Yeah, so, a successful drill exercise, whether it's a tabletop, a full scale functional, it requires preparation. You need to have a design team. And just like managing an emergency with an all hazards approach, developing an exercise comes with the same type of approach. You need to identify your objectives. What's the objective of the exercise? What's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And then you basically block it out. What are the different elements? What are the injects that are going to change the circumstances? Without getting into a whole discussion on how to design a successful exercise. You and I know that it takes some effort, and without said effort, there's always that possibility for something to go wrong. Now, let me be clear about this. An exercise or a drill that's when we want you to make mistakes. That's where we learn where our opportunities for improvement are. But we don't want the exercise itself to impact your operations adversely. And in my experience, and I don't want to harp on this too much, but man, the best place to um, work through your protocols when it comes to an armed assailant or an active shooter within your physical plant or your facility. Do you agree, Steve? It's best served by a tabletop exercise or something that's a little less dramatic because, you know, these drills can have an adverse effect on people.
Oh, they can. And I remember, and I was not involved with it, thank goodness, but I remember one incident years ago here in Illinois where they were doing an active shooter drill in a hospital. They didn't announce it. They did it as a surprise event. And they actually had I think it was a nurse administrator who ended up having a heart attack and died because of the fear and everything that went along with that. So yeah, man, you just there's so many right ways and wrong ways to do it that we could spend we could do an entire podcast on just that topic, and maybe we will, Stan. Maybe we're sitting here as we're talking about this, and obviously, these things are unscripted. We're just two chaps talking. But maybe we will do one on in the future about exercise planning and organizing, because yeah, you jump in with both feet and start with a full scale exercise. That's a recipe for disaster in itself, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. And for the risk managers that are on the call today, you've got a risk exposure. One infamous incident that happened, I believe it was Colorado, same kind of deal, a surprise drill. The actors playing the bad guys were overzealous, jumped up on counters, used expletives. They were trying to be realistic in their approach. There were two employees that filed a lawsuit against
Yeah,
the company and prevailed with a very large, you know,
out of court
a
settlement.
large,
Yeah,
right, large settlement that was, it was just a bad situation.
it really was. Yeah, and further along those lines, starting with a tabletop, it does so many good things for you. It tells you, and I do an exercise whenever I do this series with my clients or with presentations or whatever, on how we sit in our offices and write plans and
Hmm.
think that they're just the end all of end alls. And then when we get it into the field and start realizing we didn't write such a good plan, even though we thought we had. And to me, that's where the tabletop is so valuable. Number one, it gets people used to thinking about the hazard in terms of, it's realistic, it could happen, and we're just preparing for it. And at the same time, it helps us to look at our plan. Does it do what I thought it was going to do when I sat here by myself at my desk writing it? Or
Hmm.
do I have to put my ego on the shelf and say, oops, okay, we need to go back and tweak some things and fix it and do it again before we try to go any farther?
And don't underestimate the value of the tabletop and the engagement that you will likely get, even if you're not expecting it. More times than not, I will see participants, or as we know them in a tabletop format, to be called the players. The players, if you give them a little bit of encouragement and instruction to critically think through the problem and do a little role playing, man, if they're the incident commander or in charge of operations or evacuation. They really embrace that position, and I've seen so many successful tabletops because it's just a positive way to test your plans. And again, to your point, don't don't have hurt feelings when you identify or the tabletop during the hot wash or after action review process determines that the plan needs to be modified. That was the reason that you did the exercise to see if the plan was going to work.
And Stan, I'm sensitive to our time. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know how busy you are. When we talk about emergency preparedness, we can't wrap anything up until we talk about what I always call the forgotten element,
Hmm.
and that is recovery. It's the one part. And I always think of that old, when you and I were kids, there was that movie The Poseidon Adventure, and there was the theme song, There's Got to Be a Morning After.
Hmm.
And I don't think anything better typifies what we're talking about when we talk about recovery. The sun's still going to come up the next day, and life's still going to go on. Normal may never be the normal we knew again,
Right.
but we still have to think a little bit about recovery. How do you advise your clients to, and I'm not just talking about, this always comes up when we're doing active shooter training, but you need a recovery plan, in my opinion, whether you're talking recovery from a fire emergency, a weather emergency, a utility failure. That's again one of those all-inclusive areas.
Yeah. The forgotten element. I love that term. It's the part of an emergency operation that's not the sexiest part of it. You know, we can remember being firefighters, the search and rescue, the fire extinguishment, the ventilation. Then there was the overhaul, and then the tarps that needed to come out and manage the risk and things like that. Recovery is an essential component of the overall emergency management dynamic. And some could even state it might be one of the most important. First of all, consider recovery from two perspectives. First, we've got our physical recovery. We've got to tarp the roof. We've got to board up the broken windows. We've got to clean up the blood or the human remains that are left from some type of tragedy that's occurred. Then there's that emotional element. And it's, like you said, not just confined to acts of violence in the workplace that you and I are aware of on a daily basis, that we prepare for, that we help people respond to. But the emotional element could be connected to any kind of emergency. One that's coming to mind, one of our common clients, Steve, another housing provider on the West Coast, they just had a fire in one of their facilities. It was a high rise senior housing building. Fortunately, no residents were severely injured, but just the stigma of the fact that this building experienced a fire, the few dozen residents that formerly lived in that building are now experiencing great emotional stress and distress from the concept that the fire had even occurred. And they're very hesitant about going back. So the emotional support that would be needed needs to be included in your emergency plan. Acknowledging that it would be a really bad mistake to have your own housekeeping crew clean up the remnants of an active shooter situation. Now, Steve, I use that example because you and I know that it happened in a very profound shooting incident that occurred years ago.
Absolutely.
You know, you've got to think about the emotional stability and well being of your entire team. So you need to have the resources in place. Your HR department needs to be intimately connected and have those resources through your EAP or your healthcare coalition or your company's benefits program to know that if some kind of incidents occurred, like I think of that shooting that happened at that manufacturing facility in Aurora, Illinois, a few years ago, Steve, it was a normal day until it wasn't, until 5 police officers were shot, until
Exactly.
employees were killed. So, how do you grip and tackle those those elements of recovery? You have a plan for recovery. And what's the adage that we teach, Steve, in incident command? When does the recovery process really start?
Well, recovery doesn't start until the dynamic event comes to an end, but you start recovery planning long in advance of the event.
That's what I was shooting for.
Yeah,
Yes, we plan long in advance. We don't think about who we're going to call to board up our building or suck up the water and remove the smoke when we need them to do that. We think about this long before it ever happens. We don't wait to try to find a crisis counselor when we need a crisis counselor. All of those things are itemized in our all hazards emergency operations plan.
yeah. And from firsthand experience, I started as a firefighter in 1977. I got into the cadet program when I was 12, as I said, in the early 70s, and I became a volunteer on the department when I was 18 in 1977. And I got used to, just as you did, we go on these runs, we go on these fires, we go in, as you said earlier, we slobber the wet stuff on the red stuff. We put the fire out, we throw our hose back up on the trucks, and we go home and get everything ready for the next one. February 26th of 1989, 3 days to the year after I had bought my house, it got gutted by a fire. And I remember standing in my burned out living room, looking out the broken out living room window and seeing the big red truck that I normally would be leaving on driving away. And now I'm standing in the shell of a burned out living room. What the hell do I do next? And you know, you never think about what do I do after all of the excitement is over, after all the dynamic is over. How do I put it all back together? Where do I start? What do I do? And you know, every day I think back to that event. Every time I'm doing a talk about recovery planning, I use that example because it's so real to me. I didn't know who to call. I didn't know what to do first. I didn't know where to get the help I knew I was going to need. I didn't know anybody who boarded up windows. I didn't know anybody who shut off, you know, electrical and plumbing and stuff like that to the house. It was in February, so it was cold here in the Midwest. And in the absence of a plan, it was chaos. And I can think of other words that would describe it, but I can't use them on this podcast. But it was chaotic because I didn't know what to do. And that's in a simple, and I won't say simple, but a simple single family residence. Imagine that in a facility where you've got patients, you've got in a long-term care setting, you got residents who it's their home, but it's home to maybe 150 people. And so, you know, when you intensify it, then that, gosh, it's just, it is a forgotten element. But I blame us on some of that, Stan, because I think back to my days when I was a hospital risk manager, and it was not a big hospital. It was a 250 bed hospital in the far south suburbs of Chicago. Uh, and I was the safety officer as well as the risk manager and everything else that went with the title. And I would do all the fire drills. And I can remember I used to, you know, I'd go up into a nursing unit or a med surge unit or an ICU or somewhere like that, and I'd find an empty room, and I'd have a little card all written out. You've discovered a fire. What are you going to do? And I'd go in and I'd pull the nurse call light, and a nurse would come walking in, and I'd just be in there and I'd hand her the card. You've discovered a fire. What are you going to do? And I expected her to regurgitate the race plan. And then when she got to the part about extinguishing the fire, I challenged her where the fire extinguishers were at and how are you going to use the fire extinguisher? And she better regurgitate the past plan and all that. And when we did all that, at the end, it would be, okay, good job, everybody. Go back to work. We never talked about recovery. It was never even thought about. It was just response.
Yeah, I had a nursing home administrator that had a perspective. She says, you know what? We're really good at closing doors and maybe moving people from smoke compartment A to smoke compartment B. And even in the worst case scenario, I think we're pretty good at getting everybody out into the parking lot. But we have no idea what we're going to do when that captain from the fire department or that battalion chief says, yeah, you can't go back in there. So, yeah, I mean, focusing on recovery, I really think is something that every organization needs to do so that they really have a complete all hazards plan. And here's one final thought, as I know you want to wrap this up, Steve, that I want to put out there. It's that it's an all hands approach. We've got to focus on the front line. This is a non scientific expression that I'm going to share with you. I think personally that emergency planning, disaster planning is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 80% clerical and organization. It's just getting your ducks in a row. It's getting everything in place. And that's the key. You need to develop an emergency management program, not just a plan, not just a protocol, but a program utilizing a programmatic approach to the people, the training, the policies, the procedure, the stuff, the radios, the supplies. You need to have a multi-dimensional approach to having an emergency management program that addresses all of the things that we've talked about today, so that in that one moment in time when it hits the fan, when it's no longer just the normal day, a normal shift, and everything in your world turned upside down, like it did in that day in February for you, you've
Right.
at least got some path to recovery.
Yep, exactly. Stan, you've been so generous with your time, my friend, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. As we wrap up, you have any closing thoughts for our listeners?
Just, you know what? I think this is a quote that I'm stealing from somebody famous. I can't tell you who it's from. I don't know if it's from a general or from a president or a head of state. But in the absence of leadership, you've got to lead. Someone has got to take charge of the emergency. And you don't have to wait for the emergency to lead. If you're in an organization listening to this podcast right now, start to lead right now or identify who your leader or your emergency preparedness champion is going to be. Who's going to be the person or who's going to be on the team to get your ducks in a row, to put your program together, to make sure that your plan is optimized, that you train on it, that you drill and exercise on it, that you change it and modify it as needed, so that in that one moment in time, in a blink of an eye, when the tornado sirens are going off, when the flood water is rising, when the smoke is infusing throughout the building, when the shooter's on the loose in the community, you've got a plan, you've got a program, and you're going to be ready to survive.
Stan Szpytek, you are the best, my man. I can't thank you enough for the time you've given our listeners today, for the time you give me today. And just sitting here to talking with you, brother, I've thought of a couple more that maybe we can talk about doing in the not too distant future, because it's just such a hot topic, and it's one that we could go on and on and on for. And I know our listeners only have so much time to listen. You've only got so much time to give, and I appreciate it so much. Uh, Folks, I hope you've gotten as much out of Stan's time today as I have. I always enjoy working with Stan, and he and his family are second family to me. And it's just, he's one of those guys I'm just blessed to know and to call a friend and a colleague. So, Stan, thank you. And we'll talk soon.
Chief, let's get together soon, please. It's
All
been
right,
too
brother.
long. All
Stay
right, sir.
safe. Give my best.
Okay, ditto.